Let's read The Great Dewey Hunt. It's a Mrs. Skorupski story. This is hosted by Mr. Dickinson's 4th grade for Mr. Hester's 2nd grade, 11 a.m. today. The Great Dewey Hunt. On Monday, Mrs. Skorupski swooped over to greet my class at the library door. "Hello, Hugh Abernathy," she said. "So you're line leader today?" She pointed me toward the knowledge nest. The light glinted off her rhinestone earrings. The left one spelled out 000. The right one spelled 900. My twin brother Louis nudged me. "Check out her shoes." More rhinestone numbers. They were also pinned to her collar, holding her sweater closed, and decorating a ring on each hand. 10 numbers in all. "What's our librarian up to now?" I whispered. A squeaky little voice piped up from the picture book section. "Carmen, Carmen!" It was Freda Pena in her detective gear. My next-door neighbor and classmate, Carmen Rosa Pena, growled at her little sister. "You're such a twerp." Then she sailed by squawking, "Dibs on the top row of the nest." Freda looked sadly after Carmen, but Louis waved and I made rabbit ears over Louis's head. Finally, Freda giggled. "Okie dokie, oakley dokley," Mrs. Skorupski began when our class was seated. "Time to get started." Carmen waved her hand wildly and didn't wait to be called on. "It's urgent," she fluffed her hair. "I have to perform in the Girl Scout Jamboree in 12 days. I need a book of puppet plays right away." "Let's discuss it later," Mrs. Skorupski said. "Now, who can tell me about Dewey?" I raised my hand a moment too late. Carmen was already answering Mrs. Skorupski's question. "Even my clueless 2nd grade sister knows about Melville Dewey, the world-famous librarian who invented the Dewey Decimal System." "Hey, Mr. Dickinson, decimals," Louis said. "Just like math class." Our teacher, Mr. Dickinson, winked at him. Everyone knows Louis is captain of the Liberty School math team. Carmen glared. "It's not like math class. It's about books." "Actually," Mrs. Skorupski reminded her, "it is like math class. Remember the decimal point that comes after the first 3 digits of any nonfiction book? Well, today I'd like you to explore the Dewey numbers in teams of 2. I'll pair you alphabetically by last name." Louis and I pinky shook. Abernathy was the first name on Mr. Dickinson's class list. Next, Mrs. Skorupski clicked the list of questions up on the electronic whiteboard. "Any questions?" "Use a shelf marker at the shelves. Find 10 interesting nonfiction books from your team's Dewey range. Make sure each book has a different subject and a different Dewey number. Get back to the nest in 15 minutes with 10 books. Carmen raised her hand. "Is there a prize?" "Absolutely," Mrs. Skorupski said. "Each team that completes the job gets a highly sought-after Dewey Decimal System bookmark." "Oh," Carmen sighed. "I hope there's a grand prize." Mrs. Skorupski assigned us the 000 category, and we were the first team back with our 10 books. "Write the full Dewey number from the spine of each book on a sticky note in the lower right-hand corner of the front cover," Mrs. Skorupski said. Strange and Mysterious Underwater Creatures by L. Ness. When all teams were finished, Mrs. Skorupski turned to Louis. "In one sentence, please summarize the kinds of books in the 0 section." "We found a little bit of everything," Louis said. "Encyclopedias, almanacs, books on the internet, and books about strange creatures that might be real." "Exactly," Mrs. Skorupski said. "That's why we call your section General Knowledge." She turned the document camera on. "Hugh, why don't you share your books with the group?" When I finished, we carried our highly sought-after Dewey bookmarks back to our seats and listened to the other team's presentations. When it was Carmen's turn, she said, "The 800s can include famous stories plus jokes, poetry, and plays. But I didn't find a single puppet playbook, and I really need one. Besides, someone tried to trick us." She scowled at me. "We found a football book right in the middle of our section." "A misfiled book," Mrs. Skorupski exclaimed. "Thank you. Once they're on the wrong shelf, they are almost impossible to find." At the end of the presentations, Mr. Dickinson said, "Now we'll be checking out all the books you've collected, 000s to 900s, and continuing the project in our classroom." "Wait," said Carmen. "What about the grand prize?" For the next 2 nights, our team homework was to create a list of 10 small objects to represent our 10 000 books, and then to collect as many of the objects as we could. "Hey, Frida," I said that afternoon as we all got off the bus. "Want to help us brainstorm?" "Sure. Can I brainstorm and contribute objects?" Frida asked. "You can have my sister and her objects," Carmen grumbled from behind us. "She's not helping my team." The 3 of us came up with 10 perfect objects. I contributed my small, furry Bigfoot, a space alien action figure, and a 3D red plastic question mark. Lewis added a tiny computer keychain and a picture postcard of the public library. Plus, he drew a map showing the lost continent of Atlantis. Frida added a rolled newspaper from her dollhouse, an ad for encyclopedias from the recycling basket, a rubber sea monster from the Science Museum, and a miniature blank book. Frida glanced at the pile. "It's a prize-winning collection." "We couldn't have done it without you," Lewis told her. On the bus Wednesday morning, Carmen was still grumpy. "There's only one book of puppet plays in the whole library, and it's stolen." "Or misfiled," I reminded her. "Stolen," Carmen repeated, "and I need it now." At school, Mr. Dickinson collected our lists and our objects. Mrs. Skorupski promised to gather any missing objects from the lists. All week, items piled up in the library display case, separated by Dewey category. Everyone wondered what would happen next. The following Monday morning, the display case was empty, except for a big sign. I poked Lewis. "Hey, Frida is in Mr. Hester's class." "Uh-oh," Lewis muttered. "If only Carmen were absent today." Says the Great Dewey Hunt, hosted by Mr. Dickinson's 4th grade for Mr. Hester's 2nd grade. 11 o'clock a.m. today. After morning announcements, we returned to the library. Mrs. Skorupski was decked out in Dewey tights with a shawl with dozens of pictures, each with a Dewey number underneath. "Hurry, reshelve your 10 books," Mrs. Skorupski said. "Don't forget, proper Dewey order, and leave the objects where you find them." Every time Lewis and I shelved a book, we found its matching object on the shelf nearby. "Hey," I said, "the objects show where the books are filed on the shelf." "Right-o," said Mrs. Skorupski. "They're for the Great Dewey Hunt." At 11 a.m. sharp, we squeezed into the nest next to Mr. Hester's class. Excuse me. Mrs. Skorupski asked Lewis to tell the 2nd graders about the Dewey Decimal System. "It's a system for organizing the nonfiction books in the library into 10 categories," Lewis said. "That way, all of the books on the same topic are shelved close to each other." "Wow," said Mr. Dickinson. "That earns a homework-free night pass, Lewis." "You can't depend on it, though," Carmen grumbled. "Sometimes the most important books are missing." Mrs. Skorupski just went on with her instructions. "2nd graders, you will form 9 two-person teams and 1 team of 1. Each team will have a pair of 4th grade consultants." Freda spoke right up. I'll be the team of one. Then we'll be Frida's consultants, Louis volunteered. Hey, that's not fair, Carmen said. Then they'll only have one second grader. But Freda will have twice the work, Mr. Hester said. Carmen, would you rather work with your sister? Carmen folded her arms. No, thanks. Good then, let's begin, he said. There are only 3 rules for the great Dewey hunt. Mrs. Skorupski clicked them up on the whiteboard. Rules for the great Dewey hunt. Locate the objects listed on your sheet, then find a matching book on the shelf nearby. Ask your 4th grade consultants to double-check the book, then write its title and Dewey number next to the name of the object. Look for a better choice if your 4th grade consultants say your book and object don't match. Now, said Mrs. Skorupski, any questions? Carmen's hand shot up. Is this when we win the grand prize? Even without a partner, Freda was lightning fast as she zipped from one Dewey category to another. She snatched up a small Buddha statue and a book on Buddhism in the 200s. She skipped back to us, shaking a snow globe of Cinderella and Prince Charming, along with a copy of the fairy tale. I heard another 2nd grader shriek when she spotted the hairy tarantula toy in the 500s, but Freda just set it on her shoulder and grabbed a copy of Spiders of the Arizona Desert. Next, Freda handed me a toy sailboat and a book titled Into the Wind. Great job, I said. Sailing is in the 700s, but books on sailboats are in applied science. You got it right. It wasn't until she was in the 800s that she slowed down for a minute. She skipped over and handed me Performing Puppet Plays for Holidays. I think this is a good match for the little theater masks, but the number is 791.53. Hey, a misfiled book, I said. You know what to do with this one, right? Freda giggled and nodded. She tucked the book under her arm and rushed off to find a correct match. Then she handed Louis Plays for Young Audiences instead. Almost finished, said Louis. When Freda found her last object and book, the 3 of us let out a loud whoop. The first team is finished, Mrs. Skorupski handed us the 000 pennant. Who'll be next? When everyone was done, Freda walked over to Carmen. We followed behind. With a big grin, Freda handed Carmen the missing book. Carmen screamed and grabbed it. Nice detective work, Freda, I said. Yes, for a change, said Carmen. Looks like you got your grand prize after all, Carmen, said Mrs. Skorupski. Then Mrs. Skorupski turned to the 2nd grade teams. Oakley dokley, 2nd graders. Line up in Dewey order, face the 4th graders, and hold those flags up high. The 2nd graders hurried to obey. Freda, Mrs. Skorupski turned to her. Ready, set, flip, Freda called, and we all cheered. See? 000, 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, 600, 700, 800, 900. I love Dewey. And that was called The Great Dewey Hunt. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you subscribe, and I hope you come back often. See you next time.